Welcome to the new meeting of the Rotary Club of Baton Rouge. I'm your club president, well, at least for a few more days, I'm your club president, Mike Manning. It's a pleasure to be with you. We're excited that we can continue to connect despite the pandemic and the fall into phase 2 and the other things that we're facing. We really enjoy being able to connect and be able to communicate and continue to live the four-way test of Rotary. It has been my honor to be your president this year. It's really a privilege. It's been an interesting year. It's been an exciting year given the pandemic and the other things of moving to virtual meetings and a myriad of other challenges we face as an organization and we face as a community. So it's really been a unique experience. I was humbled by the opportunity to be president of the club, and I truly appreciate everyone's support and their generous acceptance of the situation and working with us to try to continue to keep the club moving forward as we move into, really starting our second 100 years. And it's a very eventful start to our second 100 years. So hopefully this is the one that we get out of the way and the club can move forward and do what it's done for Baton Rouge for years, make a difference in the community. With that, we will not have a meeting next week. So we will give you more details on that later, but I recognize Paul Moran, who will do the invitation, and then Jerry Hobby, who will lead the pledge and the four-way test.
Thank you, Mike. Everyone, please join with me for our prayer before the meeting. As we gather here today as members of Rotary, we pray that we are ever mindful of opportunities to render our service to fellow citizens and to our community, keeping in mind always the enduring values of life, exerting our efforts in those areas and on those things upon which future generations can build with confidence. Let us continue to strive to make a better world. Amen.
Jerry, your mic has been muted. Jerry, your mic is muted.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please join me in reciting the four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. 1, is it the truth? 2, is it fair to all concerned? 3, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And 4, will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Paul. We truly appreciate it. We will not have a meeting next Wednesday, July 1st, as we usually take the Wednesday nearest to the 4th of July, Independence Day, off. And we will, on July 8th, have a meeting again, another virtual meeting with the installation of officers. So I will be able to kick off the meeting and hand it off to our incoming president, Haggai Davis, and we will move forward into the future in a bright and new light with new leadership. At this meeting next week, we will have a special guest and the guest speaker of Rotary International past president, John Germ, and he will be speaking to us about Rotary serving humanity and then install the office. So it's a really unique opportunity for us to have a Rotary International past president with us to communicate his vision for Rotary and what he sees as the importance of Rotary as an organization going forward. And with that, I won't delay us from getting to our discussion today and our speaker. I call on past President Darrell Papillon to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's really my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Jee Park, who is a good friend of mine and is the executive director of the Innocence Project of New Orleans. And I want to emphasize the name for a second, because the name is the Innocence Project, not the Not Guilty Project. The Innocence Project of New Orleans was founded in 2001 to free people serving life sentences who are actually innocent of the crimes for which they were serving time in prison. Since that time, nearly 40 people who have served nearly 900 combined years in prison have been released from prison for crimes they did not commit. Jee has been a public defender in New Orleans and in the Bronx. She has a fabulous education. In addition to being a Freedman Fellow at the Juvenile Justice Clinic at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., she clerked for a U.S. District Judge in the District of Columbia. She graduated from Wesleyan University. She graduated from the University of California Law School, and she has an LLM from Georgetown. And she's also a fabulous person. It's my great honor to welcome today's speaker, Jee Park.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be with you all virtually. I have such respect for the Rotary Club of Baton Rouge, for your strong dedication to service. I want to speak to you today about injustices in our justice system. Our criminal legal system has long erred on the side of protecting innocence. The cornerstone of our criminal legal system is presumption of innocence until proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prominent legal thinkers such as William Blackstone, John Adams, even Ben Franklin have said that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. And yet, today, in our criminal legal system, it is rife with errors. It is rife with wrongful convictions. Brian Stevenson, he is a founder and director of Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, who I had a good fortune of working for right after college and before law school. And he recently wrote a memoir, which was made into a movie called Just Mercy that was released last year. He said, and I really took this to heart when I worked for him, and continue to take this to heart, is that we have a system of justice that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. It is wealth and not culpability that shapes outcomes in our criminal legal system. As Darrell said, I lead an organization called Innocence Project New Orleans, IPNO. It is an independent, nonprofit legal organization that frees innocent life sentence individuals here in Louisiana. Don't let our name fool you. We are based in New Orleans, but we do our work all across the state of Louisiana. And many people think we should be actually called IPLA, but we'll see. As Darrell said, we were founded in 2001, and in the last 19 years, we have freed or exonerated 36 individuals who collectively spent 873 years, 1 month, and 17 days for crimes they did not commit. All of them were factually innocent. They did not commit these crimes, and they knew nothing about these crimes that happened. All but one of our clients were young Black men when they were arrested. They were all poor, and the evidentiary portion of their trial lasted 1 day or less. They were all given these incredibly cursory process through a legal system that we call our justice system. Nationally, there are 2,631 individuals who have been exonerated since 1989. And 1989 is an important year because that was the year when the first DNA exonerations happened. 2,631 innocent men and women who were wrongly arrested, accused, convicted, and imprisoned. And combined, they spent more than 23,000 years of life in prison. I'm going to say that number again, 23,000 years of life. Think of the opportunities that have been lost. Think of the opportunity to build a family, have a career, watch your kid learning how to ride a bike, watching your kid graduate from high school or college, being with your sick parent on their deathbed. All of that missed because of a wrongful conviction. IPNO represents life sentenced and virtual life sentenced individuals in prison. So a life sentence in Louisiana is exactly that. You spend every day of your natural life in prison if you're sentenced to life. By virtual life, what I mean is that someone who's sentenced to 30, 40, 50, 99 years in prison. Sure, you have a determinate term of years, but the likelihood of you leaving prison alive is slim to none. That's what I call virtual life sentences. And we began really focusing on and working on life and virtual life sentences because we saw what was happening in capital cases, individuals who were sentenced to death. Now, capital cases are tried by some of the most experienced and talented prosecutors and defense attorneys in this state. The state invests a lot of resources and money into capital cases, and they rightfully should, right? If the state is trying to take someone's life, they should rightfully invest a lot of resources. In fact, there was one capital case recently that cost $14 million. And yet we know that in Louisiana, 8 out of 10 capital cases are reversed. Conviction and or the sentence is reversed, 8 out of 10. And 11 men have been exonerated from Louisiana's death row. 11 individuals who were accused of doing something pretty heinous, pretty outrageous, and sentenced to die by the state, and yet they were innocent. They were shown to be innocent years later. And so it begs the question of, would you entrust your own life, your child's life, your parent's life to a system that makes mistakes 8 out of 10 times? And if the error rate for death penalty cases is so high, we began to think, what must be the error rate for non-death penalty cases, non-capital cases? We know that over, close to 90% of individuals accused in the criminal legal system are represented by public defenders, by indigent defense system. And we know the public defenders are woefully underfunded, under-resourced, overworked, and completely overwhelmed. They have too many cases and not enough funding. Public defenders don't have investigators. They don't have funds for expert witnesses, expert consultations. They don't even have the time, because of their caseload, to develop meaningful relationships with their clients. And so if that is the arena in which these cases are being processed and being worked on, what must be the wrongful conviction rate for non-capital cases? And so we began to focus on these life cases and virtual life cases because nobody else was looking at them after conviction. Now in Louisiana, there are approximately 34,000 prisoners in our state prison. 69 are currently on our death row, and 5,000 individuals, approximately 5,000 individuals, are sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And then another 6,000 are sentenced to virtual life sentences. Louisiana, in fact, has more people, more prisoners sentenced to life than Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee combined, which is a pretty incredible statistic. Studies of wrongful conviction rates. There's been a lot of studies looking at capital cases and non-capital cases, and scholars have concluded that the wrongful conviction rate in capital cases is about 4%. That means 1 out of 25 individuals who've been convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death are actually, in fact, innocent. That's capital cases. Then looking at non-capital cases, scholars have determined that depending on the charge, the wrongful conviction rate for non-capital cases can range from 1% to 10%, up to 10%. So right now, as we are having this discussion, there could be as many as 3,400 innocent men and women sitting in Louisiana's prisons right now. And I want to tell you about one of our clients who we recently brought home. His name is Jerome. In 1993, Jerome was 17 years old. In May of that year, Jerome was at a sweet 16th birthday party in a ballroom at the Howard Johnson Hotel in New Orleans. During this party, a fight broke out between two groups of boys. Jerome was not involved in the fight at all. During this fight, shots rung out, and 3 teenage boys were hurt. 2 survived, but 1 died at the scene. By all accounts, the one shooter, fled the ballroom, ran down the street, ran down an alley, and jumped over a fence and got away. When the police arrived, they immediately sealed the room. They wanted to talk to all the witnesses. They didn't want anyone to leave. They immediately sealed the room and took down the names and addresses of everyone in there. Jerome was in that ballroom. He gave his name, he gave his date of birth, he gave his social security number, he gave his address to the police officer, and that information was recorded in a police report. And yet, 10 months later, Jerome was arrested for committing the murder at that party. Tips and rumors led the police to Jerome. And the state's entire case at trial relied on the testimonies of 2 teenage boys, eyewitness identifications and testimonies from 2 teenage boys who were friends of the young boy who was killed at that party. One of them had actually chased the gunman out of the ballroom when his friend was shot. Now, the glaring weakness in the state's case was that the shooter had fled the scene. And when the police came, they had sealed the ballroom. And Jerome was in the ballroom when the police arrived. And so in order to overcome this flaw, because Jerome couldn't have fled and then be in the ballroom at the same time, to overcome this flaw in their case, prosecution had witnesses testify that it took the police more than 30 minutes to arrive at the scene, allowing the shooter, who they believed to be Jerome, to return to the ballroom after discarding his weapon, and then blending in with the crowd before the police began taking everyone's information down. When Jerome was arrested, he had nothing to hide. He was shocked that he was even being considered as a suspect. From day one, he told the truth. He told them, yes, I was at the party. Yes, I was there when the shooting happened. No, I did not leave the ballroom. Yes, I hid just like everyone else did in that ballroom. In fact, Jerome presented 4 other witnesses, 4 other people at the party who saw Jerome hiding, and who saw Jerome in the ballroom at all times. Nonetheless, based on the 2 eyewitness identifications from the 2 teenage boys, and despite there was no corroborating evidence, Jerome was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jerome was then 18 years old. Now, when IPNO began to work on this case, we conducted our own extensive investigation, and we learned that the police did not actually arrive in the ballroom 30 minutes after the shooting, as the prosecution led everyone to believe, but they actually got there 6 minutes after the shooting and then sealed up the room immediately. And this was memorialized in a 911 call log that was never turned over to the defense. And so essentially, it was nearly impossible for Jerome to have run out of the ballroom, run down the street, run down the alleyway, and then come back in time before the room was sealed. Then as our investigation continued, the two eyewitnesses recanted. They came forward and they recanted their testimonies. One of the teens testified that they did not identify Jerome initially when the officer first came with photos of the potential suspects. In fact, he told the officer, pointing to Jerome's photo, saying, "I know that guy. I went to grade school with him. He definitely was not the shooter." But the police did not relent. They were persistent. Weeks, months, they kept on showing up, kept on showing him the picture of Jerome, saying, "Are you sure it's not the right guy? Are you sure this isn't him who shot your friend?" Then with the second eyewitness, same thing happened. A similar pressure was put on this other young man. They told him that Jerome was the shooter. They showed him the photo of Jerome. And when this witness, this teen, kept on telling the officer, like, "I did not get a good look at the shooter's face. I was focused on my friend who was shot," the police still persisted. And in fact, he decided to finally give them the information that they wanted out of him when they brought him into the police station, when they let him sit in the interrogation room by himself, letting him understand the cost of not cooperating with the police. Now, when these two witnesses recanted their identifications, the DA charged them with perjury. And despite facing perjury charges and despite facing a potential prison sentence, they didn't back away from their recantations. Jerome did not kill anyone that day, and these two people had lived with this guilt of having helped convict an innocent person and sending this person to prison for the rest of his life. And they recognized that they had cooperated because they were teenagers. They were 16, and they were scared, and they didn't know what else to do. They were Black teenage boys feeling compelled, feeling pressured. In 2014, 19 years, 11 months, and 17 days after Jerome was first arrested, Jerome's conviction was overturned and vacated by the judge, and he was freed. The judge heard all the new evidence in the case, the fact that police arrived just 6 minutes before the recantations of these identifications, and he determined that Jerome was innocent, that he did not commit this crime. There's no way he could have committed this crime. And so Jerome was fully released, and then he was later exonerated. But 20 years of Jerome's life was taken from him. Those 20 years that Jerome will never, ever get back. Brian Stevenson, who I mentioned earlier, also said that opposite of poverty is not wealth, it is justice. By justice, he means the opportunity to be treated fairly, the opportunity to be treated equitably, ability to access the courts, ability to access the resources on equal footing, particularly in our criminal justice system. And so we have to look at who is receiving the ultimate punishment in our society, who's receiving the death penalty, and who's receiving life sentences. And when you look at the population of Louisiana, nearly 33% are Black. And yet 70% of those on death row are Black. And 74% of those serving a life sentence is Black. And a Black person is 30 times more likely to receive the death penalty if they killed a white person than if they killed a Black person. At sentencing hearings, judges ask, and judges are supposed to determine whether the person before me is deserving of a life sentence, is deserving of 30 years, 40 years, however many years the statute dictates. But Ryan also says another question that we should also be asking is not, does this person deserve this X sentence, but do we as a society deserve to sentence him to life, to death, to 50 years in prison? Do we have that given the rate of wrongful conviction rate? Do we have that given how the criminal legal system disproportionately impacts Black and brown people? You know, I started with the legal premise of our criminal legal system. It is better to let 10 guilty escape than that one suffer. That is the foundation of our criminal legal system. And yet, I think we failed to uphold this each and every time. You know, in 2018, Wilbert Jones was exonerated here in Baton Rouge. Judge Anderson, in an incredibly thoughtful, well-reasoned opinion, vacated Mr. Jones's conviction because Mr. Jones was innocent. When he was arrested in 1972 for a crime that occurred in 1971, Wilbert was 19 years old. And he came home 46 years later in 2018 as a 65-year-old man. He has a distinction of having served one of the longest sentences as an exoneree in this country. I don't know if that's a club that he wants to belong to, but he certainly has that distinction. Wilbert was convicted based on the testimony of a single eyewitness. She was mistaken, but she was believed, a single eyewitness. And as a result, Wilbert Jones lost three-fourths of his life. And we know that eyewitness cases are troubling cases. We have seen that, you know, more than 70% of DNA exonerations, those initial convictions occurred as a result of eyewitness identifications. We know that our memory is not as reliable as we like to think it is, or accurate, and that eyewitness misidentifications happen more often than not. 46 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Interestingly, today is my birthday, and actually I'm turning 46 today. And so as I was writing these, as I was thinking about this, my statements, my comments this afternoon, I was thinking about Wilbert and thinking about 46 and my own age. And I think about everything that he missed out. You know, the chance to have a family, just chance to spend time with his elderly parent, chance to hold his niece and nephews, everything. And it's really deeply painful for Wilbert and for everyone who is wrongfully convicted, despite the fact that they did not commit the crime. People often ask me, what can I do? How can I help? Because when they hear these stories of wrongful convictions, they're moved and they're really shocked and bothered. And particularly now, when a lot of attention is being paid to our criminal legal system and policing. And there are a lot of questions about, is our system as fair as it should be? Is it just? Does it treat everyone equally? Or does it disproportionately impact Black and brown communities by treating them with particularized violence, with harsher sentences? So I tell them two things. I tell them, one, you should spend some time learning about our criminal legal system, right? Learn its history, learn about its impact, learn how it is that we as a nation and we as a state came to be the incarceration capital of the world. How do we come to this state? Because when I was born in 1974, the prison population in America was 200,000 people. The prison population today is 1.6 million. How is it that our prison population exploded nearly 500% in the last 40 years? How did that happen? And so do some research, do some reading. Read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. That's an incredible story of how he freed and exonerated an innocent man in Alabama's death row, Walter McMillan. And Walter McMillan was actually the first exoneree that I met when I worked for Brian in Montgomery. Read other books. Read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Read Shane Bauer's American Prison. Listen to podcasts, the Wrongful Conviction podcast with Jason Flom. Watch documentaries. So learn and soak this in. Keep an open mind. Don't prejudge. And then support organizations like IPNO and other local organizations working on this issue. Go to events. Follow them on social media. Find out what's going on in your community. And then the second thing I tell them is to stay engaged. Stay engaged with your vote. Criminal law is local, right? Don't just vote for the incumbent DA or the judge or the legislature. Really find out what's their vision for moving us forward into a 21st century criminal legal system. Right? What is their vision? Does your district attorney have a vision for starting a conviction integrity unit? Nearly 100 district attorneys across this country have started conviction integrity units to go back and re-examine old cases to undo errors and wrongful convictions. Does your district attorney do a particularly careful look at eyewitness cases? Do they conduct further investigation in those cases to find other corroborating evidence, or do they just rely on an eyewitness? Does your judge always give the most harsh sentence? Is the judge compassionate and considerate and kind and thought about the implications of a sentence, not only on that person who's in front of him, but to his family, to the community? And then with legislators, talk to them about criminal justice funding. Are all the branches of the criminal justice equally funded? Are the judges getting adequate resources? Is the DA getting adequate resources? And then with public defenders, seek them to get adequate funding, to get funding that's in line with all of the other criminal justice stakeholders. Make sure the public defenders are not overwhelmed, that they have resources to effectively investigate and litigate those cases. And then taking all this information, obviously using your vote. But it starts with learning about the system, talking to others, asking the hard questions, and then participating in our democratic process. I thank you so much for having me this afternoon, and I would love to engage in as many questions as we can.
Okay, so the first question we have, which I think you mostly answered, was from Alicia Murphy. How do we volunteer if we don't have a law degree or a legal background?
And so we have even high school volunteers in our office. We actually have a summer internship program that brings high school students on. There's a lot of clerical work, administrative assistance that I could use. Our office we have 16 people. We have 15 actually. We have 15 individuals in my office. We're pretty lean office, and so we use our volunteers pretty well. You can help us scan records, organize files. You help us, with some of our events planning. We have a lot of volunteers to help us table at events. So there's lots of opportunities for non-lawyers to help us actually.
Okay, and we had several birthday wishes for you.
Oh, thank you.
Including Jared Ambo. He also said, thank you for the very important information. You guys are awesome and doing very good things. We have another question from Jeff Zimmerman. Has there been any studies to show what percentage of wrongly convicted cases are attributed to poor policing, as in bad investigation, or poor lawyering, wrongful prosecution, or underfunded, kind of things like that?
Yeah, there's actually a great website called the National Registry of Exonerations, and it's a website that's kept up by the University of Michigan Law School. And they keep data on all exoneration cases across the country. And in fact, let me see if I have this information really quickly here. They actually divide up the wrongful conviction cases by the different factors that go into causing wrongful convictions. So for instance, there's, eyewitness misidentifications, there are false confession cases, there's false forensics, right? There's also misconduct. And I think in there they say about, I don't want to misquote, I can't remember, but I think it's about 30 or 40 cases are due to misconduct on the part of police officers, or misconduct on the part of prosecutors, or misconduct on the part of defense attorneys. And this is not intentional, malicious misconduct. Oftentimes it isn't. A lot of times it's gross negligence, especially on the part of defense attorneys who are incredibly under-resourced. And if you have, 120 cases that you're working on at one time, it may be that you don't do everything that you needed to do, but that falls under misconduct, under ineffective assistance of counsel. Sometimes prosecutors don't turn over exculpatory information, favorable information to the defense, because even though they have a duty to know everything the police does, sometimes that information doesn't come to them from the police officer who investigated the case. Or maybe there were multiple police officers who investigated the case, and that information doesn't necessarily come to the prosecutor to provide that to the defense. So it's not always malicious when I say misconduct. I don't want people to think misconduct, it's malicious, it's intentional. A lot of times it isn't. It could be just gross negligence.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Can you volunteer virtually with your project?
So we have law clerks this summer virtually who are doing a lot of legal research and writing. And so if you have any sort of paralegal legal degree, we can certainly use you virtually, because our work continues, obviously, as many of your work does as well. And so we have law students currently who are interning with us and doing virtual legal research and writing. And so, yes,
okay.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned a website on the question from Jeff Zimmerman. Is there a URL for that website that you have access to?
You mean the
web address?
The National Exoneration Registry of National Exonerations? Yes. I don't, but if you type in National Registry of Exonerations, it would pop up right away in Google, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. We have another question from Warren Burkett. How does one recover resources available from lost years?
So Louisiana does have a wrongful compensation, a state wrongful compensation law, but unfortunately it is one of the worst compensation laws in the country. And so if you are wrongfully convicted and if you're deemed to be innocent, you can get $25,000 for up to 10 years only. And so maximum payout from the state would be $250,000. So Wilbert Jones, the man that spoke about at the end of my talk, he did 46 years. If he receives compensation, he would receive $25,000 for only 10 of those 46 years. And like I said, it's one of the worst compensation statute in the country. Our sister states, Alabama and Mississippi, also have wrongful conviction statutes, but they provide $50,000 per year for every year that you were wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for. So if Wilbert was wrongfully convicted and imprisoned in Mississippi, he'll get $50,000 for 46 years. And then in other states, I think the national average for annual compensation amount, I think it's $60,000. So.
Okay, so Ben Berkeley was asking, 90% of prisoners claim they are innocent. Does the squeaky wheel get your attention?
No, I mean, it's not the squeaky wheel. I mean, being a squeaky wheel helps, but that's not why you get our attention. We actually spend tremendous amount of time in the front end investigating our cases. And if we can't, if we determine that there isn't a cognizable innocence claim, that we don't take the case. And so when the prisoner writes to us, we send them an application. It's a fairly lengthy and bulky application they need to fill out. And then from then on, we collect every information that we can, all the public records, every information we can about the case. And then we conduct our own investigation. And sometimes we find evidence that's more inculpatory. And if that's the case, we drop the case. Sometimes we find a case in which DNA testing would be ideal. And if we can locate the evidence in the case, and oftentimes the evidence doesn't exist anymore, or it's been misplaced or lost or destroyed. But if we can find evidence in the case, then obviously we try to get that evidence DNA tested. But it's a fairly extensive process to find, to call out all the different cases and to work on that innocence case.
Next, the next question: do you expect unanimous juries to have an impact?
And so, as most of you guys probably know, Ramos, this was a Louisiana court case and went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and U.S. Supreme Court in April ruled that Sixth Amendment right to trial means that you have a right to unanimous jury verdicts. And obviously, this U.S. Supreme Court decision in Ramos follows Amendment 2 in Louisiana, because we all already decided that we wanted unanimous jury verdicts back in November of 2018. But what Ramos did was that it applied to individuals who are currently pending in direct appeal, which was really important. So for our cases, all of our clients' cases, their convictions are final. And the constitutional amendment does not apply to final convicted cases, closed cases, and Ramos' decision doesn't apply to final convicted cases. And so at this point, it doesn't really have an impact, but there's litigation happening right now challenging whether or not the Ramos decision should be applied retroactively to individuals whose convictions are already final. And so it may actually impact our clients. And we have seen that, at least in 40% of our exonerated cases, in our innocence cases, they had a non-unanimous jury verdict. So certainly in those cases, there were one or two jurors on that case who believed in the client's innocence or had serious questions and doubts about the state's case. And so we do see a fair amount of non-unanimous jury verdicts in our cases that we're working on. But whether or not Ramos is going to be retroactive to these cases, it's still an open question.
Okay. Jerry Hobdy says the documentary also discusses the difficult task of selecting cases. Can you share the name of the documentary?
The documentary, do you mean Just Mercy or the 13th? Or there's several different documentaries out right now on Netflix. There's the Innocence Files. There's like a 5-episode documentary called the Innocence Files that follows 5 different innocence cases. There's a documentary called the 13th that talks about mass incarceration in the United States and how it is that we became a mass incarcerator in the world. I think, as I mentioned, Bryan Stevenson's memoir, Just Mercy, is a movie. It's not a documentary, it's a feature film. But Bryan, the making of the Just Mercy movie is a documentary right now, and I can't quite remember what it's called, but something justice, I think. So there's lots of different documentaries out there.
Okay. David Beach asked, are there other local justice initiatives or prison reentry programs you would recommend our Rotary members support financially or by volunteering?
Yes. And so in Baton Rouge, there's actually the Louisiana Parole Project. So Louisiana Parole Project was started several years ago by an incredible young man who was a child. He was a teenager when he was sentenced to life. in prison. And when he went to prison, he did tremendous amount of work. Like he grew in leaps and bounds, and he was A1 trustee. And when he received parole, he started this organization called Louisiana Parole Project. His name is Andrew Hundley. He's really incredibly impressive. He runs an amazing organization that provides services to individuals coming home on parole. And so he provides them with counseling, support services, with housing, and it's just all around an amazing organization to get involved with.
Okay, wonderful. Another question from Jeff Zimmerman. How does Baton Rouge area rank in the state for wrongful convictions compared to other areas in the state? And are those statistics actually kept?
Yeah, and so again, this website that I mentioned earlier, the National Registry of Exonerations, they give you state-by-state data. And you can actually go into their detailed state sheet, and it's really manipulable. You can really play with it pretty easily. And it shows you what parish the convictions happen, what parish the exonerations happen. They tell you what was the factors of wrongful conviction. Was this a DNA case? Was this a mis-ID case? Was this a Brady case, which is prosecutorial misconduct case? So this data, this website would be really, really helpful for any sort of information about data on exonerations. And in terms of Baton Rouge, so in our casework, we've had 2 exonerations from Baton Rouge. We've had Wilbur Jones, we talked about, and also Archie Williams last year. Because we were based in New Orleans, and because we did start our work in New Orleans, we've had the most exonerations we've had is out of New Orleans.
Great, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your insights into the Innocence Project.
Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.
Okay, this is a reminder that there will be no virtual meeting next week. We will be back on Wednesday, July 8th with Rotary International Past President John Durham as our speaker, and the installation of officers. So between now and then, take care, have a great Independence holiday on the 4th of July. Try to stay safe. Let's not have too many big groups together so we don't spread the virus. Take care, everyone.